start first off, just so we give everybody the background of what the heck a vitrified fort is.
Yeah, it's not a vitriolic fort. It's a vitrified fort.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
I don't know what either of those things are, so.
I was pretending.
A vitriolic is like an angry, hysterical fort.
Oh.
Saying nasty things about you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Nobody likes that.
That's one of those words that I am now realizing I've read like a million times.
I still don't know the exact definition.
Well,
of
no,
it.
I totally do, but I've just never, I don't think ever heard anybody ever say it.
Mm-hmm.
So for whatever reason, it was different in my brain, and
I understand.
yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Anyway,
Okay. For our story today, we're talking about vitrified forts.
yeah.
Vitrified forts are stone walls which are built surrounding some kind of defensible position. So most of them are going to be found on the tops of high hills. That would be, the great place to build your village, your castle, and then keep the enemy from being able to easily invade it. You can easily defend it.
Also safe from floods.
Yes.
Good point.
That's very true. Insurance salesmen love those places for that reason. Sometimes the walls themselves are short spans of distance. Sometimes they're long. Sometimes they're pretty tall. Sometimes they're actually kind of short. And sometimes there are a series of walls that will circle one another. In other words, it's almost as if there's walls that are sandwiched between walls,
That's what they used to have typically in castles. There was an outer and inner wall.
Yeah, no, it is. It's very traditional in that regard. And sometimes because they were built on hills, they could have embankments or they could be surrounded by ramparts, from the lower slopes of the hills. So these things are going to be in a whole bunch of different areas and they have a lot of different configurations. But part of that variation in terms of the size of them is going to be because of the time frame or their age. Because vitrified forts, we don't exactly know when they were made.
Yeah.
It's believed, according to the current research, that they were made somewhere between 700 BCE and 700 CE.
So really just no time difference at all.
And there's lots of them when we get into the numbers but there's more than one, obviously enough. But there's lots of these things spread over a pretty big geographic area.
And it seems like actually some of them could actually be older than that. So they could be, they could be, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 years before Christ, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. We're really not sure in this one.
Yeah, it's really, as far as what mankind was up to back in those days, we don't really know. I mean, seriously.
It's really, that's one of my favorite, the big overarching unsolved mysteries is like what?
What did we do before TiVo?
Yeah,
I know. I mean, it could be that 10,000 years ago we had some, in places like Europe or even in America and like North America, we had like some sort of Mayan kind of civilization, and it's either been, taken over by flooding from sea level rises because sea level's been going up, as you know, for 10, 11,000 years. I mean,
we talked about some of that in the Who Settled the New World First about coastal villages being destroyed by rising sea levels.
Oh, absolutely. So, I mean, there's all kinds of cool stuff out there that's just been obliterated or else it's just underneath a whole lot of layers of sediment.
And we get those weird things like Gulbekki Tepe that we talked about way back in the beginning where it's like these things that are indicative of these like larger cultures and more sophistication than we give people from that time credit for. And I think that, that's why mysteries like this are always interesting to me because it's like...
Well, in technology, what's great about a lot of these things is technology. Each advance in technology seems to spill a little more of the information out for us. You've seen all of this stuff now about how they're checking satellite footage and they're using the growth patterns of trees and then the terrain to be like, oh, wait, no, you see that? There's obviously the foundation of a building there. You just can't tell it from being on ground level. Like there's all these algorithms and tricks that they're using that they're finding so fast now because of that. So are we never going to know the answer? Maybe. Will we know some of the answers? Probably.
So we've just spent the last 10 minutes talking about why this is a really cool mystery.
And haven't talked about the mystery at all?
Yeah.
Let's talk about that's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why it's intriguing now the mystery is set.
Yeah, okay, so here's the thing about vitrified forts. Whoever built these forts, and by forts they're a wall around a fort is the easiest way to think about it. Whoever did amounts of heat and in doing so melted the rocks that the wall was composed of and this would fuse or weld the smaller and larger rocks together. So instead of having like a nice stacked stone wall, which is Joe's favorite kind of wall,
True.
they would have one that was literally glued together. And keep in mind, as we've been talking about, this is 2,000 plus years ago, and concrete and mortar were not an available.
As far as we know.
As far as we know. Now, okay, so as far as we know, concrete and mortar was not around. Concrete and mortar seem to have been used by the Romans starting around, I want to say 500 or 600 CE, but prior to that, gosh, I can't think of what the other civilization was, but they were using bitumen, asphalt.
Yeah, the Egyptians, I think, used concrete. I think some of the blocks of the Great Pyramids were actually formed on the spot, from one theory.
Well, they used some kind. Yeah, it was a gypsum base. They were burning materials that had gypsum and ash and creating mortar with that, and then the ice starts with an M. I can't think of it, but
the Mycenaeans.
Macedonians, is that one? Were they before the Romans? We're going to get an email. Somebody's going to correct us because I can't remember. But the point is,
I think the Mycenaeans were pre-Roman.
This was a technology that wouldn't have been available. So to not just stack your rocks, there's some value in that.
So you're just saying it wasn't just like a giant magnifying glass?
Oh God, no!
They held up and just walked.
No.
Along.
Well, why not?
Maybe we might talk about something like that, but for most things, we're pretty sure that they weren't doing that.
Okay.
Now, the catch with making a vitrified fort is, depending on who the researcher is, it could strengthen the wall or it could weaken the wall. Some sources will say that the process of vitrification will weaken the wall because what it does is it melts some of the rocks into a glass-like state, which can make them brittle, and it can crack the larger stones. But on the opposite side of the argument, researchers saying, well, yeah, those bigger stones, though, they're cracking, they're becoming more porous, and then the ones that melt into glass-like state actually melt and go into those pores, so when it hardens back up, you've got a super, super strong bond between these two stones.
Oh, so we're saying that the intentional difference of stone reaction was intentional?
Well, it was most likely it was an accidental discovery, like a lot of things, but they were like, whoa, this is really, really strong. And depending on which, I'm sure, as with all things, people experiment. And depending on the mix of stones, some are going to unheat, going to vitrify and turn to that glass-like state. And some are just going to crack some because they have higher melting points.
Interesting.
So if you combine them correctly, you can make a super strong wall.
Yeah, I can see the argument for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually not having a wall that's all solid and just rock solid like that, that your enemies can't just run up and like fling a big catapult rock at and sort of knock the top stones off the bottom stones and stuff like that. That'd be kind of handy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Or people, there's stories of the guy who walked by every day and just pulled a stone down and nobody realized it was a giant gaping hole in the wall because he did it just so slowly and cautiously. Like, you can't do that. They're welded together. So it's got a huge benefit. And there are times where it appears that this was very much done intentionally or deliberately, because some of these walls are built on bedrock that would have a really, really high melting point. So high, in fact, that you couldn't vitrify the stones to it. It wasn't going to create that porous condition. So people would actually go get large stones, sometimes from great distances away, and use them as their foundation so that the rocks above, when the melting happened, would fuse to it, so the bottom of the wall was fused to something large and stable. So there does seem to be some very deliberate action that was taken for this.
Yeah, and they were smart enough to figure out that having a good solid foundation is key.
Yeah. There's a reason you don't build on sand.
Yeah.
It falls apart.
And tsunamis too. But
there's that. Vitrified forts, as we said, they've been around for thousands of years, but officially they weren't noted or discovered until the late 1700s. And at that time, it was believed that they were pretty well contained to northern Scotland. Today, we know that there's about 60 or 70 vitrified forts in Scotland. There's a little over 200 of them total having been found, and they're spread across northern and western Europe. So some of the reading has been that probably what happened is the folks that knew how to do this would then begin to go and share the technology with their allies. Oh, hey, let me help you out. You know, we've got this pact between each other. I'm going to show you how to do this thing I do. And then slowly the technology spread, though obviously it didn't go a long time because there's only about 200 sites that we found.
I wonder if some of it had to do with like marriage.
Oh, I'm sure that kind of...
Marriage.
That kind of
talking about fiefdoms marrying together or something?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I am. It's, you know, that sort of that consolidation of power, but also because it's like a kind of a small number actually, and and kind of a intentional spreading, and either it's, you know, certain people were just building their empire out, which is also possible because, you know, again, we don't have very great records from that time, or, you know, it was, I don't know, you know, somebody married somebody's wife or somebody's brother and said, oh, hey, by the way, we've been doing, this is how we do it, you know, where we're from. Let's build something like this so I'm safe.
Let's do some vitrification, yeah.
Do some vitrification, man.
Have a vitro party.
Yeah.
Well,
But,
it's like a bachelor party, but better.
Yeah.
The difficulty is that we don't know exactly which civilization was doing it. And there was all kinds of Germanic tribes in the area in the northern part of Britannia. I think it was called Britannia, is what they referred to it at that time. But there was the Picts and some other civilizations, but nobody, because obviously there's no written record.
Yeah,
We don't know,
seems...
so it's always hard to say. Well, why did it spread like that? Was it through, through marriages, or was it through military alliances or conquests? It's hard to say.
One of the more interesting questions for me is, why did it go out of style? Well,
I think I have a pretty easy answer to that. Concrete.
That could be it. But,
air high five.
Yeah. But no, it actually, it seemed to go out of style prior to the invention of concrete. And according to some of the theories out there, it had to do not so much with construction as destruction.
Yeah.
And in which case, I'm really curious about why it went out of style.
Well, and that's a great segue into theories, because believe it or not, once again, I've done it. We've got a really short story, and the rest of this episode is all theories.
Well, you have two different theory sections.
Yeah, well, that's how I get away with it this time. You two told me last time, don't do that again.
The episode was too short. Not really.
Okay, so we have two sections of the theories. Section 1 is how was this done, and Section 2 is why was it done. We're going to start with how. Yeah. And so,
I'm more curious about why myself.
I know.
That's why we saved that for last, so people actually listen.
I find the how obscenely interesting for some reason.
I find both of it interesting.
So let's get into this now. We need to establish a couple of things first. We've talked about the fact that it takes some really high heat to vitrify stone. To give you a frame of reference, the melting point of the stones that are used for this process at this time was somewhere between 1100 to 1500 degrees Celsius, which is 2 to 2700 degrees Fahrenheit.
What is that in Kelvin?
You're killing me. But if you also need to keep in mind is that's a lot of heat to generate. And you've got to keep it up for a sustained amount of time. It's not as if you can just get it to that temperature and then it's done. No, it has to have time to act upon the materials. So you've got to be able to maintain that heat.
Yeah, for like what, at least a couple of days, probably, right?
At least hours. At least I don't want to give a number of hours, but a lot of hours.
Longer than it takes your beer bottle to melt in the campfire.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. You also need to remember, a lot of people will say, oh, well, humans at that time didn't have the technology. And if you think that, you're actually wrong, because this falls right in the Bronze and the Iron Ages, when man had learned how to melt ore to make all those fancy tools for killing each other.
In a forge. In a super contained environment.
But the
But yeah.
technology had been figured
Yeah,
out
the
on
idea
how
of
to
melting,
melt that stuff.
Yeah, the idea of melting stone, or it's out there. Yeah.
So it is something that is available, and I was doing some reading, and at the time, the forges of blacksmiths around this time frame, somewhere between 700 to 700, it was not uncommon for them to be able to sustain fires of up to 1500 C. So they've got the ability.
Yeah.
Again,
In a contained space. I totally understand that.
because that's the big part of that, right? It's like you can't get a wood fire, campfire up to heats like that, really.
No.
Because it's got to feed off itself and be self-contained.
Correct. Yeah. No, I get it. I get it.
Is it the coke that has to get that hot?
I imagine it would have a better success using coal, stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I would think you would.
Okay. Shall we start into now we've given that little baseline? Let's do theory 1, which is this was done in the initial construction of the wall. And theory 1, subsection A, you're going to love this episode, Devin. There's all kinds of subsections
Yeah,
in
but
here.
you didn't use bullet points, so that's kind of bumming me out.
Well, it's because it's too big of areas, and it would have taken this 4-page thing into 7 to have
Yeah,
it
that's
all.
my trick.
Oh, is that why you do that? Okay.
Have you noticed a really wide margin? Yeah.
And really big print.
It's just
Yeah.
like 2 words a page. Yeah.
Okay. The first theory we're going to discuss is the kiln method. And the idea
That's
here
a
is
big
that
kiln.
yeah. Well, the idea here is that what the builders would do is they would take the larger stones that were going to be the inner and the outer face of the wall, and they would lay them out, and then they would place smaller stones in between them, and then they would take almost like gravel or even finer stone and pour them on top of that again. And of course, you think about it, well, the big ones, then the gravel's going to fall in, it's going to fill in all those voids, so it's pretty packed. It's relatively a densely filled space. It's kind of like packing peanuts. It's what packing peanuts are for. They fill up all those air voids.
Right.
Now, all the while that this is being done, wooden beams are going to be laid across the wall from one face to the next, or logs. They don't necessarily have to be beams, but logs from the inner to the outer face. And wood is also going to be scattered amongst all of the stone debris. So we've got now a bunch of varying sizes of stone and a whole bunch of fuel that's all packed in there.
And that's to vitrify the internal core between the two outer solid walls, right?
Correct, because not all of these walls are super thick. I mean, some of them are only a couple of feet across.
Some of them are like, 25 feet thick.
Yeah,
I mean,
so it
wall.
varies
Yeah.
from wall to wall. So it would probably, I don't know if it would actually be easier to do a small one versus a large one, because it's easier to get more fuel in the big one. But the point is, there's tons of fuel, and in this idea of the kiln method, you would then take earth and pack it around a couple of the sides of the wall, so that it would then retain what heat is going on. You put turf on top to cap the whole thing, and then you light the whole thing on fire. And from that point, because there is earthen walls around it, the heat's going to be contained. It's going to radiate within itself, and you're going to get the maximum usage out of that heat from the burning fuel, rather than it's like Devin's in a campfire. All that heat would just go whoosh straight up in the air.
Yeah.
Instead, it's stuck in there, which is why your doors
Yeah.
and windows seal so well in your house, so you can retain the heat
But the
and
only
get
problem,
maximum.
the only problem being is just getting air to your fire to make it burn super hot.
Kind of
You would
air
need to get
holes.
a lot of
because
that,
you gotta have air flowing through this thing in one way or another. But it turns into a giant furnace. It's gonna melt everything inside. And this doesn't necessarily have to have been done when the wall was at its full height. I mean, you could build several feet of wall and cap it and cook it, and then dig it out, put the next layer of rock and fuel, and do it again, which would help prevent stability issues. Because if you're filling it with wood, then of course as that wood burns and turns to carbon and then charcoal and then dissipates, the material is going to want to settle in there. And there is obvious signs of posts and beams being in these vitrified forts. they've actually found the impressions. So we know that they were sticking wood inside the wall to some degree, at least.
So, I'm sorry, I'm having a really hard time picturing the way that you're describing this.
Okay, here's an idea. I'm going to use a really dumb analogy.
Okay, should I clarify what I'm having a hard time picturing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm having a hard time picturing where in the wall the wood is. So you've got your wall, like this. Is the wood going through
horizontally from front to inner, from the outer to the inner face, and then there would be wood inside of it.